Hello, today's date is Tuesday, November 21st. My name is Brendan Powers, and I'm a graduate student in the Salem State University History Program. I have the great pleasure of being joined by Mary Maisie Crowther, who is a descendant of Rebecca Nurse. We are here today as part of the Salem Witch Trials Descendant Oral History Project. So welcome, Maisie.
Thank you, Brendan.
Thank you. As we are here today to talk about the witch trials and the events of 1692, before that, could you give me a little background as to location of birth and general family background concerning your upbringing from an early age?
Okay. Well, I was born in Boston, but my family had an orchard in Ipswich, Massachusetts. My grandfather had one. And so I still go back there. And from that experience, because we lived in an old house built by Robert Goodale in 1669. It was built before the witch hysteria, and it was part of Old Salem Village. And so I had a little bit of the ambiance of the 17th century as I grew up. There's more about that story we can get into, but I think my dad was always interested in what was happening with the Rebecca Nurse house. And I found some little scrap of paper from 1980 something about the Danvers Fire Alarm Company. And he was interested in joining that and supporting that a little bit. And I just put it away because I was so busy raising a family and I didn't think about it until I discovered a few references to Jacob Goodale that spurred me on to find out a little bit more about him, because he was not a victim of the witch hysteria, but his boss, Giles Corey, was. And so that kind of weaves into the story of the Salem witch trials in a broader sense than just Rebecca and Mary and Sarah. However, Three Sovereigns for Sarah, which was a video series that we saw Vanessa Redgrave feature, and it was a wonderful description of the real feeling about the spectral evidence. And I had not really thought about that because the judges did not rule out spectral evidence in those days. And so that led to something else and something else. And then my brother wrote something as though he were Dr. Griggs. So that all came down through the family, and we all took pieces of the story and embellished on them.
Ah, fair enough.
So that was kind of, not a nutshell, but...
Right. I know that you referenced the 1980s. When, as a child, just looking back on it, can you think of your earliest recollection of maybe a familial story, or when did it first come to your attention of your links to the past?
It was referred to, because I was the youngest in the family, that when the wind blew in the chimney of this old house, it must be Jacob. And then when things happen, and old houses have different ways of settling, and, you know, we can always link things to the physical world. But it was sort of a joke amongst the family members that, you know, what's going on here? It also came out, I think, when I was about 9, 10, and beginning to understand about American history as well. And there were other parts of that. There was an old millstone. There is still, I believe, an old millstone in front of the front door of that house that was moved over from West Peabody to Ipswich by my family. And people thought that might be one of the millstones that might have been Giles Corey, but we don't know. You know, it was all conjecture and a little bit of fun, not to be taken too seriously.
Fair enough. So that brought you to an early age. And those are some specific stories. Could you tell me a little bit of your link to Rebecca Nurse? And as you said, you lived in the Goodale house. What was the meandering course from the 1690s to find its way to you in the 20th century?
Yes. There are evidently two links, one through the Tarbell family, and the Town Family Association has that linkage down every generation. They always try to link you in one way. And when I joined the Town Family Association, I had to do quite a bit of research, which luckily my dad had done. So it came down through my great-great-grandfather, Stephen Lincoln Goodale, who married Prudence Aiken Nurse. So that's the first connection with the Nurse family name that I can remember, and that would be 1820, 1840, something like that. And they lived in Saco, Maine.
Excellent. Sorry. So one thing that I thought was fascinating a little bit was just the link to the Goodales, and we'll get to Rebecca later, but about the house. In the family for 300 years, moved from Peabody to Ipswich. I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about the move in 1928 for the home, and then afterwards, just a little thought about the decision to sell and having it move outside the family after so long.
I'll start at the end.
Yeah, fair enough.
Because I was just there, and I have very nice new neighbors now, but my sister had we have a little tow hole right next door to this old house, so I didn't see the new owners today, but they're flourishing. And the house is pretty much the same. It has some restrictions on it because it has some historical features. In 1928, my dad had a patient in Boston. He was an ear, nose, throat, a physician. And he came with a news clipping of this house that was up for sale. And was there any interest? Did Dad have any interest? Dr. Goodale, do you have any interest? He said, well, 1928, that was kind of on the edge of a depression. And he said, well, I don't know, but I'll see if my wife and I can go down and look at it. And they did, and they went with an inspector who tested all the beams, and most of the wood was solid, still fine. But it needed to be sold, and they checked their finances, and I can't believe that it was going for what it was going. However, it needed to be moved because Dad had been given some land in Ipswich next to the orchard. And the house could not be lifted onto a flatbed because they did not allow anything to go over Route 1. There wasn't a 128 then. There was just Route 1. So they had to take it apart, piece by piece, beam by beam, post by post, and load those things on to a flatbed. So little by little, it got rebuilt. I have some pictures here about that. Which I can leave with you. But this is this picture of the Isaac Goodale house in the early days. And then this is what it was in 2008 when we put it up for sale. Here's the...
Oh, the millstone.
The stone.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah.
Very
in
nice.
the front door. So...
Yeah, I always get a kick out of when looking at areas of Beverly Farms. They had to move a number of estates when they put the train in.
Yes.
And it was all done on the backs of Irish laborers in the 1800s.
Yeah.
But there's fantastic little old archival pieces at the Beverly Historical Society, covering bit by bit how it all happened.
Yes.
Perfect. So that's the link, and then to Goodale and to Rebecca as well, and the home. So you learned about it at an early age. You ended up leaving Massachusetts to find your way to Minnesota, to go to Carleton College.
To college, yes.
Did the historical background of your family, the home in which you grew up in, how did that impact you in choosing that path to go to Carleton, study history?
Well, through my secondary school education, I went to Concord Academy, and the headmistress at the time, Mrs. Hall, brought me into her office, and I thought, well, I'm a junior, I've got to start thinking about this. And she said, well, there's a very nice girl who went to Carleton last year. I think you would enjoy it as well. In other words, it was up to her to find places for each of us to try to go. And so I applied. And I applied to several other places, and some said yes, and some said no. But I thought, going out west, that would be really fun. And I had been out west in 1947 with my family. We took a road trip. I was 11. And we stopped in Minnesota. We were going to go to Wyoming, to a dude ranch, because this would be nice to learn about riding. And it was the first time, and maybe the last time, the family could do something together. So we took a month off and went on the back roads, because there wasn't any interstate at that time. So we took our time, and I came home. I said, Mom, I think I'll apply to Carleton College. Where's that? Minnesota. Where's that? I said, don't you remember that we went out? Oh, yes. And then the interesting link later was I was all packed up to go, 1954, and we had just been beaten by the Hurricane Carol. And trees were down, there was no electricity, but I had to get to the airport, and I had everything packed. My uncle, Edward Goodale, was visiting us, and he said, well, where are you going, Maisie? I said, I'm going to Carleton College in Northfield, Minnesota. Carleton? Well, that's Lawrence Gould's college. And the connection there was that he had been a dog team driver with Larry Gould and the Admiral Richard Byrd expedition of 1929, 30. So that was a real old connection with the college I had no idea about. And some people say, well, you got into X college because your great-grandfather went there. Well, there was no there was no lineage genealogy on that one. But there was that connection, and proved to be a very heartwarming one for me, to know somebody had a connection.
Right.
And he was a geologist. Larry Gould was a geologist, and as time would tell, a lot of that story came out. And he had written his own book, Cold, which I advise anybody to read, because it tells you about the scientific expedition into the interior. And Eddie had two very good friends, Norman Vaughn and Freddie Crockett, who also signed on, and there were some others. So they had a really good time. Well, if you don't mind freezing.
Yeah, well,
But there were some adventures.
Temperatures are all
But that's not why I went to Carleton, but that was sort of a connection.
Yes, but your decision to study history.
And then to study history. And one of my wonderful history teachers was from Lucille Pinkham. And she was a terror. She taught British, English, parliamentary procedure, parliamentary documents of the Tudors and the Stuarts, and I began thinking, should I have to Well, I did take her seminar. This was really tough. But when I decided to major, she said, "You will never regret majoring in history. It's the best discipline to live with." And I've thought about that over and over again, because every time an issue comes around in our own country, you begin to think, oh, it connects with this and that and the other, and you have a different perspective.
Oh, yes. How do you think being a history major and your ancestral links to the trials and the events of 1692, can you take us through how that's impacted you from the background as a history major and the pedagogy that you get there and the course of events that have taken you, and it doesn't need to be every moment, every week, but larger themes. How has the link of a history major plus the link to the trials impacted you in your research, your understanding? What paths has it brought you down?
One of the things that comes to mind as a response is that poets and playwrights have been fascinated with this theme.
Yes.
And if you read The Crucible, Arthur Miller's, really gives you the feeling of the court trials and the fear. And this was written in the 50s when we had a rather unsettling national crisis. And Henry Longfellow also, in his New England Tragedies, brings out a lot of this feeling of something mysterious going on in New England. And I think he was much more interested in the poetic rendition. He wanted to make it into poetry. Arthur Miller had more of a investment, I think, in the emotional aspect and getting people really thinking about it. And when they refilmed it in Ipswich.
Yes, Daniel Day-Lewis.
Yes.
Yeah.
That was an interesting part of this whole thing, too. I think history gives us different lenses. So as I say, you can have a 9-year-old lens. Oh, wow, what is this all about? And you can get into the feeling of a 13-year-old going through identity crisis. And then you're going to have a 20-year-old when you say, oh, I was Rebecca Nurse's descendant. And everybody says, what? And especially out in Minnesota.
Yeah.
Who are you? What is all that about? And they don't really get it. And then, then you have a family, and you come back to what really could have happened. And there were so many reasons. And the Town Family newsletter, from time to time, gives different perspectives. And there have been many historical studies. Nussbaum, I think Nussbaum has one, and Marilyn Roach here has another one. She took it from the point of view of the ladies who were afflicted or just living at the time when. And I like to think of history as thinking about the time when. What were the economic factors? What were the social, the religious pressures? And what was the medicine? And at Carleton, I studied medieval medicine a little. Well, I did a paper on, the 4 elements and Galen, and, I had to sort of figure it out. But I began thinking 17th century was just coming into a dawn age of a little bit more psychological interest. What I didn't know was anything about Tituba and her background, and that was interesting to speculate upon. And Roach speculates, I think she goes into quite a little bit of detail about she might have come from the South America and to the Barbados, and then up through, she might have been just rescued.
Right.
Yeah, and all of that. And then I began thinking, why are the puritanical elements here? And what was the medicine like? And they just couldn't figure out that, what was afflicting these girls. And it was a fearsome time. And I think the economics, too. Now, they're on the other side of the tracks or the river or whatever, and they don't belong in our parish. And there was that kind of feeling. There was also, I think in Salem, there were many other immigrant groups. There were the French, and there were several others from different ports that came in, and probably from Europe. They had a lot of trade with the homelands in Europe. So there were a lot of elements that were new that were coming in. And I think the opinion, my IMO,
there you go.
that the puritanical feeling of this is why we came, this is the direct route, this is the only way. However that's manifested now, I don't speculate that. But I don't think they could handle a ritual that involved anything other than being in church. In other words, on a lovely moonlight night, if you wanted to go out and, have a little campfire. And I think this is what Tituba was interested in metaphorical terms. She wanted to free up these girls who were probably terrified of, brimstone, put it that way. And they didn't know how to deal with somebody who, mix an egg white and there was all of that in the legend. I don't know if it actually happened, but these are the things people read about.
Right. So how does what people
I'm
read and write about, how does that differ from the stories that you heard as a child? I know that you mentioned the wind blowing of Giles, et cetera, et cetera. But what was the narrative, let's say, from your parents or your grandparents as the story went? What was your exposure like, and how does that compare to your opinion now of, as you said, the vision of a 9-year-old to a 13-year-old to a 22-year-old to a Exxon, as we move on down the line. What has that involvement been like? Or how does it, not even the involvement, but just that first childhood inkling of growing up in that home and thinking about these things, and to now being well-versed and reading a number of books and writing your own tale. How's that work? Do you find yourself sometimes sliding back into the stories of childhood and being like, because, so-and-so told me this, I'm going to put more weight on it, versus I've read this from X scholar from insert prestigious university here. And how does that play out as a descendant and as somebody who has grown up in the midst of all of this?
It wasn't a very definite story that we had to adhere to, put it that way, to begin with. This was not gospel truth in our family. It was a lot of conjecture. There were several inklings down the way about the Goodales and the house in West Peabody. But it wasn't, part of it was the house. And I'll tell you that in Ipswich over the past few decades, they've had 17th century days. And you're supposed to dress up. Well, this was quite a while ago. My mother was dressed up as a Puritan, my brother also, and then some of my nieces got dressed up as little girls in their little collars and their little hats and everything, and they greeted people at the door, and this was about 1978. I mean, it was quite a while ago. And the long line came up, and we had a guest book, and my mother would greet at the door, and she would tell them a little bit about the millstone. And she loved stories. She liked to embellish upon them. If something wasn't quite right, she made it right. It made it fit. So she said, well, this was the millstone from Giles Corey. And some lady who was visiting said, oh, now I'm from the Corey family, and we have the other one.
Oh, wow.
And that story kind of was interesting.
Yeah.
To see that there are people around who are interested in, so maybe it was a good thing she said that, because she was interested in the other side of it too. So I was interested in the other side, one should be in history.
Yes.
And that was an inkling about what was the Corey family up to? What was he like? You know, he had 3 wives. From the others being perished or whatever happened to them, but it was common to have a wife, and the wives worked hard. They probably got worn down. Anyway, yes, Giles may have been a hard-working man. And there was another thing that came out. This may be a ramble, but the story of the judge of Southwick. And that came up again at a reunion at Carleton not too long ago. This classmate said he had roots in Connecticut. And then I thought, that's interesting. So I sent him what I knew about Francis and Rebecca Nurse's adoption of the Southwick family children, or one of the children. Because their parents were Quakers, and they had been exiled from Salem. So that was another whole issue about the, you might call it shunning, or the actual being thrown out of the parish. So that left people and children behind, and Francis and Rebecca were welcoming them into their family. So that was another connection from an adult point of view that I wanted to research, and it was also talked about in this volume. I think one reads new histories and compilations of one sort or another with half an ear and half an eye open for the I wish this were true. Or it might not be true, but I want to make it true. Just like this is the millstone from Giles Corey. Or maybe not.
Right.
You know, it's just interesting. My nephew and my sister Jane went to the site of the mill, and there is a Goodale cemetery near West Peabody somewhere. And they went to the site of the mill. And it's interesting that the town family, I think, has picked up on some of that story. Also, the interesting point about the fact they think they found where the gallows was. So all of these have come out along with the ergot and the medicines and all the other things. It's all like pieces of the puzzle, you know. That's
slowly coming together, but slowly getting.
I don't know if that answers your question. I'm not good at answering right. You know.
No. It's good to ruminate and just talk and hear the tales and see how we can piece them all together.
I have to tell you, I had a good history teacher at Concord Academy. The first test that I ever took in her class as a sophomore, it was all true or false. And I got 50.
Yeah. Well, it's because you had the coin. You were just flipping.
I couldn't answer yes or no. There was always something else that could have happened.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Well, it's interesting that you started to bring up Proctor's
Proctor's Ledge.
Yes,
that's it.
So, just thinking about Salem now, being a Ipswich native, still being a New England native, coming back every now and again, you've seen a sizable transformation in Salem in your lifetime. I guess where I'd want to start with that is, what's your view of it? What is your, let's just start with, take me through how Salem has changed, whether it's commercially or physically, and then we'll talk about your feelings about it, and then we'll move into the memorialization of said event. So, since as long back as you can remember, just tell me a little tale about the changing way of Salem and the way in which it incorporates the events of 1692.
Okay. It's a little patchy.
That's okay.
Because I don't think we came over to Salem very often. But we did go to the museum. And we, at one point or other, went by the House of the Seven Gables. That was definitely something. And I read Hawthorne's book not too long ago, and I think that was an interesting tale. And we went around the block. There was not the big lure of Salem in our family so much as there was Essex or Gloucester, Rockport, that kind of thing. Salem was something we left alone a little bit. I don't know whether it was because the family just didn't want to go to the Witch Museum. I really never had a desire to go. It was not too long ago that I said to my husband, let's go to the Rebecca Nurse house. We've never been to Danvers. So we went to 62, we found it, and we had an incredible tour and listened to the tape in the barn.
Yep.
You know, that was incredible. It really brought it to life. But it was always something that we'll get to, but not. It wasn't a pilgrimage that we felt we had to do. Mainly, I don't know why particularly, but I think coming to the museum and walking around and the old port, that was interesting. And it wasn't really until later when I was doing some work on Jacob that I realized there must have been a lot of trade. It was a major port and business. Interesting from that point of view. So over the years, when I moved up to Brattleboro, and I've been there 50 years, but coming back on the summertime with my family, yes, we'll go over. We'll see. We'll go to a interesting show or something. Coming over to the Beverly, we went to the what was that wonderful Cabot Theater?
Oh yes, it was
the
just
magic shows.
Yep,
you know.
the Grand David.
Yeah, right. That was a big highlight. That's where I got my driver's license in Beverly, and I worked at the Beverly Hospital as a volunteer one summer. So, you know, I kind of remember this area when I was growing up in a lot of ways.
One thing that we've talked a lot about in our class is just the commercialization in Salem that has transpired over, I mean, even in my lifetime I'm 34 now, but I remember being a kid, being less so, and now I don't remember when Haunted Happenings became the biggest thing in the world in October, which is the big month-long celebration for Halloween. But I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about your feelings about that, the fact that as a descendant of a very turbulent time in this area's history, and to see what it's become and how it has morphed or grown into however you envision it, for good or for ill. If you could just discuss that.
Well, this is what I think about that.
Okay.
It's an economic situation. And if you have a legend, unfortunately, if you have something terrible happen, I mean, I think of worse places like the storming D-Day, the cliffs of Utah. You
Yeah.
know. Yes, that's going to be a big feature. People are going to really talk about that's known. In a way, it's a good thing because it brings people's attention to it. I'm just not sure that they're getting the message that it was not a situation of a cult.
Mm-hmm.
It was not dark. It was a dark time, but it was not the intent of these beleaguered women to invoke ill upon their neighbors. It was not the intent. It was the fact that they did not understand that there are miscarriages that happens, nature. There are fires that happen. There pigs get out of the enclave.
It happens.
It happens. They are not overlooked by some demon or devil, and they believed that the devil played a hand in all of those things. And I think this guilt that pervaded was imposed upon these women. Rebecca's words, I'm a Christian woman, I haven't intended any ill. I haven't done anything. I don't think I've done anything wrong. Because they were devout and they followed the daily rituals of their day and the Sundays, and they observed good manners. But it just got going, and you can imagine, I think of it today, you can imagine things get going. What do they call them? The memes?
Yes.
And so in a way, this was one of the first memes that we've experienced as a colonial nation, a nation that is in the process of becoming a nation. And I think we ought to give it its due in terms of what truths we know about it. And some of it is conjecture. We have to understand people are people, they're not automatons. They didn't have cell phones, they couldn't say it.
Couldn't capture every moment.
No, but I don't know what that, I think someone said to me when she said she grew up here, and at the high school, that was a mascot.
Yes.
It was the logo. It was the, rah, rah, witch and everything.
Oh, yeah.
And of course in Halloween, I was a witch one Halloween when I was 12.
Yeah.
I had a tall peaked hat and a black cape, and I didn't think much of it particularly, but I think when we're young and adolescent, it's mysterious, and we don't know how the world really runs. And people talk very lightly about good and evil, and anything that they couldn't explain was evil.
Yeah.
In a way, in their physical world. That, I don't know, again, if that...
No.
It's just, I don't think it should be just glossed over in terms of rah, witches,
Right. Yeah, less of a capitalism-driven show up here, and we're going to tell you this tale, and we're going to magnify things as opposed to giving it the due diligence and the solemn nature that it deserves. And I guess that's where I was going to follow up. I think this year they had well over 100,000 people again who show up on Halloween, and it's all about this. They've recently created a memorial, Proctor's Ledge. And I was wondering if you could talk about that, because it's kind of interesting where it's located, because it's out of the hubbub of downtown, and it's more secluded, and you have to go down a quiet street, or relatively quiet street, to get there. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that is a site I would like to see myself at some point. I also think that people should realize that you can reenact everything, like the Joan of Arc story. You could reenact. That really touched me when I was a teenager. They had a mocked up
Yeah.
Joan on the stake.
Yeah.
But if you don't want to reenact a hanging,
No.
and unfortunately, that is happening.
Mm.
And you don't want to glorify that
Right.
either. It is horrible.
Mm.
And I don't suppose I've ever witnessed a real hanging. And I wouldn't take my children to it.
Right.
Unfortunately, when you think that in those days they did take their children, and the impact on the children must have horrified and must have been a sobering lesson for good or ill. I mean, for misguidance. I don't know. You can't be shielded too much from the horrors, but I don't think it should be glorified. And these ladies were not made saints of either, but they were common, ordinary women, and that some of them were in desperate straits to make ends meet. The story of Mary Warren was interesting. How she tried to be a housemaid to a family and how difficult that was. And just imagine today how it would be. I think that may be the gift of history, because you are a human being. You have a human condition, whatever it is. And you have whatever you were given as that condition. We have very little to say about that, really, from our birthday. But we can learn to broaden that empathy. And I think history gives you that sense that you are not alone. You might not have been Rebecca. You might not have been Mary or Tituba, but to try to put yourself in those shoes. And we need to do that, I think, more.
Yes, yeah. So that could be a
Yeah.
very resounding lesson from
Yeah.
the events of 1692,
Yes.
inclusiveness, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes. And I think I go back to Arthur Miller, because I think he brought a play together that gives an opportunity to the actors and actresses a chance to delve into the character and the mind. So I think from the point of view of roles, what do you want? We say role playing, but you have to learn about a character if you're going to play that character. And when I went to the Rebecca Nurse house, there was a little bed. It was Rebecca's bed. And I thought it was, what is it? Sleep tight. Well, you sleep tight because
Yeah, you have to tighten everything.
yes, you have to turn the ropes underneath to make it tight.
Yeah, you can't have it sag.
Yeah, and I kept thinking, that's where that comes from.
Right.
And I saw a very simple life, a lot of work. No wonder they got tired.
Yeah.
That's-
It's tough toiling all day.
yes, it is. And then not to be understood by strange young
You're right.
kids. What are they doing? And I do think there's still a mystery about it. I think history is mystery.
Yes.
We don't know it all.
No, and what would be the fun if we did?
But I think to give it its due honor, and I think they have given a monument to the victims, and that is a beautiful stone that they have erected, I think, in honor of
Yes.
him. So I don't know. I got into the Jacob story because of partly the house, but partly I wanted to find out more about it, and so I'll give you this.
Oh, okay.
And it has to do with the day that Jacob got up. If he lived with Isaac, he might have lived with Zechariah, who was our direct descendant. But Isaac, he might have lived in a house like that. And he comes downstairs, and it's November, end of November. It's this time of year. Cold, rainy, blustery. And he has to go across the field to his job. He might have lived with Corey, actually, but I put his last day,
Yeah.
you might say, here. So he goes across, and why are you late? You know, blah, blah, blah. And Corey beats him because he hasn't done his job. And Roach seemed to think, and there are probably reasons he might have been slow. I don't know. Goodale had sold Corey 50 acres. And maybe Jacob's working there was part of the deal. You take my son and he'll work too, you know, and give him something to do. He was perhaps a different sort. I don't know. But anyway, he didn't live up to his job, and he was the recipient of many beatings. And yet he had his good heart. I gave him a good heart. And he would like to talk to Mrs. Corey sometimes, and she would invite him in and made it sort of softer, you know. And then Giles didn't like that, naturally, because of Giles being Giles. I invented this, but I felt that it would give a picture of what might have happened. There was a witness to the very bad beating that he had, Elisha, and he fainted. And it was Mary brought him back to the house where he died. So we always thought, well, he died on the doorstep, and so he's made it simpler. But there were court records and the coroner's records that he had bad clots, blood clots in the back of his back. And so it wasn't just that day, maybe. But for whatever it is. And then I list references and the town family and what we knew about this, and a little bit about the house being rebuilt. So anyway, I'd like to, you can take that. I did bring it to one of the town family gatherings. I didn't bring it, I sent it to be shown. So the town family may have a copy of that. The story is my story. You know, it's not to be considered historical fact, but I do have a lot of references from different places in there. And I just felt he needed a little bit more say-so than this was about Francis. Okay. This is about Southwick, the judge. Having been relieved of militia duty and having served a term as a constable, Francis occasionally sat on grand juries and trial juries in Essex County's quarterly courts, gave evidence in land cases, and helped inventory the estates of deceased neighbors. In 1676, he was part of a coroner's jury that considered the alarming death of Jacob Goodall, which isn't a slow-witted man, allegedly beaten to death by Giles Corey. The court decided that Corey was not the sole means of the man's demise, but set him a heavy fine nonetheless. A little slap on the wrist. This essentially favorable ruling made some folk conclude that Corey had bought his way out of a murder charge and its accompanying noose. Goodall's death and the thwarted justice would continue to be a topic of gossip. In 1677, Francis was named guardian of the orphan teenager Samuel Southwick, whose grandparents, Lawrence and Cassandra Southwick, had been exiled from Massachusetts years earlier as convicted Quakers. Convicted Quakers? Convicted. Are we convicted if we're anything different from?
Well, I mean, you can go back and look at 1641 with Mary Dyer in Boston.
Yes.
Put to
yes.
death.
Yep.
Refused to renounce her beliefs.
Yes. Yes. Yep.
If you're
Well,
looking at,
anyway, that was part of it.
oh no, perfect. If you were going to surmise or think about what percentage of this, so you said some is research, some is imagination,
Mm-hmm.
and how much of it is story, like family story? Was any of it?
A lot of
Okay.
it. Yes. And I think in the introduction, I mentioned
Oh, okay.
a little bit more
Yeah.
about what we've talked about. It was just a curiosity. And then as we knew, my sister and my brother and I, and my other sister, we knew we probably couldn't hold on to the house and the land anymore. So we put it up for sale, and that spurred me on to
Yeah.
try to bring something to a conclusion in a way, mainly for me, I think. I just really had a hard time letting go
Well,
of this house. And you had asked me about that
Yeah,
at the
300
beginning.
years almost.
And it was because I enjoyed bringing my family there, my friends from school, and people thought it was a nice place to grow up. It has a nice view of the marsh, and you know, it was just a family meeting place. We'd sit out on the porch. The porch was not part of the original house. It was a barn that they added on, but it was our family gathering place, and that was hard to let go.
Yes.
And yet I'm the only one really left. I have a sister who lives in Bedford still, but we are the only siblings
Right.
left. So, I'm interested to know what other aspects of this whole era come out for you as connecting in any kind of parallel or
Yeah.
ways that you can see
Yeah, it would-
patterns.
It will be very interesting when we sit down and start looking at all the tape and transcribing and starting to gather. As I said when we were walking up, this is my lone interview. So I am not yet privy to themes or greater movements, but I will certainly tell you afterwards because I will be conducting an analysis and listening to everybody else and trying to gather and see what path or similarities we find along the way.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, one thing I wanted to ask, just because I thought it was interesting, was obviously the story has impacted you in your writing, but you also do watercolors. Now, as an artist, is this where your outlet for the family story is in your writing? Does it impact your watercolors? Does it impact anything else?
Well, I got started doing watercolors more after college in the early 60s. And one summer I was waiting to go back to school or teach. And I took some classes over in Rockport. And that started me off to do a lot of watercolor. I don't know that it has an awful lot to do with my writing. I do like to go to the beach, the Crane Beach, and I take a sketchbook almost any time I go. And it's part of my environmental interest, really, because it is a wonderful resource protected by the trustees. And it's also features in a lot of photographs in my family albums. Dad was very interested in making comparisons. I came across a whole lot of 1970s, 80s, what is that, Kodachrome?
Mm-hmm.
Remember that?
So side-by-side shots of how
Yes,
things have
yeah,
evolved and changed?
This year, this year, this year, this year.
Yeah.
And the curve, as you come across the boardwalk, and the curve of the land
Yeah.
was always changing. And then it would grow, it would be eroded back, and then it would
Yep.
grow back. So it was a seasonal change, but then after a while, the dunes became very vulnerable to storms. So in 1970, he and several people on the Conservation Board in Ipswich invited or were hosts to some Russian people who were interested in erosion management. And they had been planting, the Ipswich conservation people had been planting grass along the dunes, and they wanted to show, and Dad was sort of involved with that. And so there's a lot of the conservation interest
Right.
in that. I don't know what that involves there. It involves in my other interest in geology
Right.
and conservation.
Yes. No, it's
Which is
interesting though,
landscape.
that you say the ebb and flow, because as you've told in your story, you see the ebb and flow of the story of the events of 1692 and how they vacillate back and forth, and they come, and some things gain more notoriety at certain points, and other times a historian will detract from that, and then it will flow back,
Yes.
and so on and so forth.
Yes.
In coming to or beginning to wrap up, what is there anything that we didn't discuss that you feel is important for memory, your genealogy, and your story that I may not have touched upon? Something that should be said for posterity's sort.
Okay, because we're teachers,
Correct.
I think that's where it is. I think the sooner we can teach young children about our various backgrounds, our cultural backgrounds, our belief systems, who our ancestors were. Around New England, it's probably a little easier, although I don't know. I think we have an opportunity in this area, in Massachusetts Bay and New England, Virginia too, to teach children. This wasn't all hunky-dory time.